You know, there are moments in life that don't make headlines because of what's said in front of microphones, but because of what's said behind closed doors, and sometimes it's what happens after the words are spoken that carries the most meaning. You know, sometimes people look at a meeting between two leaders and think it's all about policy, strategy, or whatever headline the news wants to run that evening. But every so often, a meeting happens that cuts deeper than politics. It's not scripted, it's not about cameras or statements, it's about something more personal, something more human. When I sat across from that young man, I didn't see a title. I didn't see the medals or the uniform. I saw someone carrying something heavy not just on his shoulders, but in his heart. There was a weight in his eyes, a responsibility that doesn't come from ambition, but from expectation. From knowing that people, real people, struggling people, are looking at you like you're the last chance they've got. That kind of weight doesn't come from power, it comes from purpose. Now, he didn't walk into that room trying to impress anybody. He wasn't loud, he wasn't performative, he didn't hand me a list of demands or rattle off a speech. No, he came in grounded, focused. And he looked at me not as a politician looks at another politician, but as one man looking to another, someone who might just understand what it means to lead when the lights go out, when the crowds leave, and when the decisions you make leave a mark, not just on paper, but on lives. We talked not as adversaries, not even as allies, but as men who have stood in that lonely place where leadership forces you to make choices that no one else sees and everyone else judges. And I'll tell you, he didn't flinch. He didn't justify, he didn't make excuses. He spoke with clarity, with conviction, and more than that. With care, he spoke of people who haven't had much not for decades. People who have been talked down to, manipulated, ignored. People who are tired of being told to wait, to settle, to just be quiet and accept things the way they are. That struck me. Because, for all the conferences, for all the policy memos and bilateral summits, at the end of the day, this thing called leadership, it comes down to who you serve, and whether or not you remember that your seat is not a throne, but a responsibility. He reminded me of that, not because he said it, but because he lived it right there in how he carried himself. There's a kind of silence that speaks louder than applause, and in that room there was no shouting, no slogans, just honesty, and honesty is rare, especially when you're wearing a target on your back and still refuse to bow. And I know some folks out there are going to wonder why that meeting even mattered, why a handshake, a conversation, or a hug means anything at all. But here's the truth: those moments, they matter more than most people will ever know. Because when people from different corners of the world sit down, not to conquer each other, but to understand one another, that's where the shift begins. That's where old narratives start to crumble, and something new, something better, has a chance to grow. We weren't there to negotiate deals or sign treaties. We weren't there to make anyone feel small or offer favors. We were there to recognize something in each other, the quiet struggle of trying to lead in a world that rarely makes space for leaders who tell the truth. And we found that common ground, not in our histories, which are different, but in our hearts, which are not. So no, that meeting wasn't about politics. It was about two human beings acknowledging the fight, the fatigue and the fire that keeps a person moving forward even when the world tells them to sit down. It was about dignity, about resilience, about what it means to say, I see you. I may not agree with everything, but I see you. And in today's world, that kind of recognition, real recognition, is more powerful than any policy. That's what happened in that room. And that's why it'll matter long after the headlines fade. There's something remarkable about watching a new generation rise, not just in age, but in spirit, in intention, in clarity of purpose. Because leadership, real leadership, doesn't always arrive with gray hair or years in a legislature. Sometimes it comes through the voice of someone young, untested by traditional standards, but shaped by something even more powerful. Proximity to pain, urgency, and the unmistakable truth that the old way just isn't working anymore. When I looked at that young man, I didn't just see today. I saw tomorrow. I saw a shift. I saw the kind of energy that makes institutions nervous, not because it's reckless, but because it's honest. And when you're honest about broken systems, when you're unafraid to call out the cracks, well, Those who have grown comfortable in the cracks start to feel exposed. This generation, they aren't waiting for permission. They are not asking to be seated at tables that were never built for them in the first place. They're building new tables. They're tearing down the old blueprints and saying, we want something that actually works for all of us. And that's not rebellion, that's renewal. That's what progress has always looked like, even when it made people uncomfortable. Now, there's this idea some folks still cling to, that with age comes wisdom, and with youth comes recklessness. And sure, experience matters, but let's not pretend experience is the same thing as vision. Experience without humility can become arrogance. It can keep us chained to systems that no longer serve the people they were meant to protect. But vision asks different questions. It doesn't just ask how things have been done. It asks why, and more importantly, it asks why not differently. This young man, this leader, he's part of that vision. He didn't inherit a polished script. He inherited chaos, corruption, external pressure, internal disillusionment. He didn't step into an office padded with comfort and ceremony. He stepped into a storm, and instead of ducking for cover, he planted his feet and faced it. That kind of courage, unshaped by decades of compromise, reminds us that generational power isn't about chronological time, it's about emotional truth. It's about someone saying, we've tried your way, now let us try ours. And that's not disrespect. That's accountability. That's the natural evolution of a people who are finally claiming their right to dream and decide for themselves. Too often, older systems try to train young leaders into becoming echoes instead of architects. They tell them to be patient, to be grateful, to play the game. But what happens when the game itself was never fair? What happens when the rules were written to keep certain voices out and certain profits in? What this generation understands, what this young man understands, is that you cannot heal a wound with the same blade that caused it, and he's not alone. Across the continent, across the globe, young leaders are stepping up not to mimic what they've seen, but to rewrite what's possible. They're pulling lessons from the past, but refusing to be buried under it. They're leading with clarity, clarity that comes from growing up watching their parents work hard but go nowhere, from seeing their communities pray for change and only get silence. That clarity is not naive, it's earned, it's informed, and it's potent. Now, I won't pretend that youth has all the answers. Nobody does. But what it does have is the hunger to ask the right questions. And in that hunger lies the seeds of transformation. Not just of government, but of identity. How a people see themselves, how a nation decides who it belongs to, and what it will fight for. So when I see that kind of leadership rising, I don't see a threat to the old guard. I see a gift to the future. I see a bridge between what we tried to build and what they might finally complete. And I believe if we're wise enough to listen instead of lecture, if we're humble enough to guide without gripping too tightly, then something extraordinary can happen. Because generational power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens best, who leads with love, with courage, and with the belief that tomorrow can be better, not just for some, but for all. That's what this new chapter looks like. And I, for one, am hopeful. There are times in life when words fall short, when the moment speaks louder than any speech ever could. When something as simple as a hug carries more weight than all the statements, press releases, and carefully chosen sound bites combined. That's what happened that day, and I can tell you, it wasn't planned. It wasn't political, it was human. Now, people like to analyze every move you make when you're in the public eye. They want to know why you looked a certain way, stood a certain way, said a certain thing. But sometimes there's no script, no message to craft. There's just a connection, a pause in the noise, a moment of understanding between two people who, in their own ways, know what it feels like to carry something bigger than themselves. When we stood face to face, after everything had been said, there was nothing left to add. We had talked about struggle, about responsibility, about pressure, and the loneliness that comes with leadership when the crowds thin out and the decisions get harder. And in that silence, after the final words had been shared, I stepped forward and embraced him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't for the cameras. It was instinct, because I saw in him something I've seen in myself. The exhaustion that doesn't come from physical work, but from emotional labor, the kind that wears on your spirit, the kind that shows up in your eyes, in the quiet between your sentences, and when you see that in someone else when you really see it, you don't shake hands and walk away. You show them they're not alone. People later asked what the hug meant. They used words like symbolic, powerful, unexpected, but it wasn't meant to be any of those things. It was just meant to be real. Because we live in a world that trains leaders to be guarded, to be composed, to wear strength like a suit of armor, but true strength, real strength, is knowing when to take that armor off, even if just for a moment. Even if only with one other person in the room who understands. I've learned that sometimes when two people meet with the burden of their countries, their people, their histories on their backs, what they need most isn't another plan or proposal. It's recognition, not applause, not approval, just someone who looks them in the eye and says, in their own way, I get it. That hug wasn't about politics. It was about humanity, about honoring the fire inside someone who's been tested, who's had to stand tall while the ground shakes beneath him. Someone who's chosen to lead not because it's easy, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. And in that moment all the noise faded. The titles, the expectations, the headlines, they didn't matter. What mattered was the shared understanding between two people who have felt the weight of expectation, who have faced criticism from those who have never had to make a life-altering decision, who have stayed up at night thinking not about polls but about people, the hungry child, the grieving mother, the unemployed worker wondering how long they can hold on. That's the weight he's carrying. And when someone carries that kind of weight, sometimes the most profound thing you can offer is not advice, it's not critique, it's not even encouragement, it's presence. It's standing beside them, arms open, and letting them know, even just for a second, that they're seen. Now, I don't know what people took from that image. Some probably saw it as soft, others as political theater, but I know what it was. It was one leader telling another, you don't have to do this alone. And maybe, in a world as divided and cynical as ours, that's what leadership ought to look like more often. Less performance, more presence, less noise, more listening, fewer speeches, more truth spoken in silence, shared in something as simple as a hug. Because the world doesn't just need stronger leaders, it needs more human ones, and that moment was a reminder we can be both. There's a certain kind of power in words spoken quietly, away from the glare of cameras and the chatter of reporters. Those words, when shared in a private moment, often carry more weight than the loudest public declaration. Because when you speak not to persuade a crowd, but to connect with another person, you speak from a place that is raw, honest, and true. After hours of conversation, as the room settled into a quiet pause, I found myself looking at him. This young leader, this man burdened with the future of his people. And in that moment, I didn't feel the need to say something grandiose or sweeping. Instead, I chose to speak simply, words that mattered not because they were crafted to be remembered, but because they were meant to be carried forward quietly in the heart. I told him the world may not understand you right now. They may question your methods, your decisions, your resolve. They may not see the struggles you carry or the hopes that drive you, but keep standing. Time has a way of proving the honest ones right. There was silence after that. Not the awkward kind, not the uncomfortable pause you get when someone doesn't know how to respond. No, this was a moment filled with understanding, with the kind of respect that doesn't need to be shouted, but is deeply felt. You see, leadership is often misunderstood. People think it's about winning applause or gaining popularity, but real leadership, the kind that moves mountains, is about conviction, about standing firm when the easy path is to give in, about knowing that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone for a while. And it's that solitude that shapes leaders, refines them like fire shapes steel. That's the thing about final words spoken in private. They're not for the crowd. They're for the one who's walking the hardest path. They're meant to remind them why they started, to rekindle the fire when the nights get long and the doubts creep in, because there will be doubt. There will be criticism. There will be days when the weight feels unbearable, but those final words, they're a quiet promise, a call to resilience. I've been there myself. I've faced moments when the noise outside felt louder than the voice inside. When the pressure to conform, to water down your vision, was immense. But I also know that time has a way of revealing truth. What seems controversial today can become celebrated tomorrow. What feels like resistance can become the foundation of progress. That's why I said what I did, because I wanted him to know that the path he's chosen, no matter how lonely it feels now, is part of something bigger, something enduring. That history doesn't belong to the popular or the loudest, but to those who dare to stand firm in their principles. And in that quiet exchange, I felt a connection, not just between two men, but between generations, between those who have paved the way with their sacrifices and those who are now tasked with carrying the torch forward. It's a heavy burden, but also an honor. Reporters and onlookers may never fully grasp the significance of those final words. They may speculate, analyze, and spin their own narratives. But the truth is, those words were meant to be a seed planted in fertile ground. A reminder that leadership is not a moment on stage, but a lifelong commitment. And to anyone listening today, to anyone who feels the weight of responsibility on their shoulders, remember this. It's not the applause that defines you. It's the courage to keep standing when no one is watching. The courage to stay true to your values when the easy path beckons. The courage to believe in a better tomorrow, even when today feels dark. Because that is what leadership is, not the headlines or the speeches, not the accolades or the power, but the quiet, steadfast commitment to a vision larger than yourself. And sometimes those final words, spoken in a quiet room, echo louder than any public declaration ever could. That's the power of truth, and that's the power of hope. There's a long history, too long, of the world looking at Africa and thinking it knows what's best. The narrative has often been one of outsiders coming in, telling people what to do, how to lead, what paths to follow. Sometimes it's wrapped in good intentions. Sometimes it's driven by interests disguised as aid or advice. But regardless of the packaging, the message is often the same. You need us to fix you. That mindset, however well, meaning it might appear as a form of disrespect, because it ignores the truth. Africa is not a problem to be solved by others. It is a continent of tremendous complexity, strength, and resilience. A place where innovation and courage thrive every day, even if those stories don't always make the headlines. It's a place where people are shaping their own futures with their own hands, on their own terms. When I sat down with a leader from Africa, someone who has stepped up in times of crisis and chosen to lead not from the sidelines but from the front, it was clear to me that what the world needs to do more than anything else is listen. Not lecture, not dictate, not impose, but listen. Listening means humility. It means acknowledging that no matter how much you think you know, you don't have all the answers. It means recognizing that the solutions to the challenges Africa faces, whether political, economic, or social, will come from within. They will come from leaders who understand their people's dreams and fears, from communities who have long histories and wisdom that outsiders often overlook. Too often, the international conversation about Africa is framed as if it's a charity case, a project for the global community to manage, but that's a mistake. It strips people of their agency. It reduces rich, diverse societies into problems waiting for a fix. And it dismisses the fact that many African nations are already taking bold steps that sometimes challenge the status quo, steps that require courage because they disrupt established power dynamics. This is the new reality. Leadership in Africa today is not about following a script handed down from others. It's about rewriting the story, about owning it, and the world should respect that. Not with empty platitudes, but with real support that comes from partnership, from equality, from mutual respect. That means no more preaching, No more telling leaders how they should run their countries or what policies they should adopt as if there's a one-size-fits-all formula. It means appreciating that leadership looks different in different contexts, that what works in one place might not work in another, and that sometimes progress looks like upheaval because old systems were broken to begin with. What I witnessed in that conversation was a leader who embodies this shift. He's not waiting for permission. He's not looking for validation from the world's powers. He's focused on his people, on their needs, their aspirations, and their dignity. And that's a powerful message, not just for Africa, but for the world, because it's a reminder that respect is earned, not given, that support should empower, not undermine, that real change comes when people own their futures and the world is there to walk alongside, not to push or pull. So here's the call: listen, really listen, put aside assumptions, put aside agendas, and open your ears and hearts to what African leaders and communities are saying. Their voices matter, their experiences matter, their solutions matter. If the world can do that, if the global community can shift from a posture of lecturing to one of listening, then we can begin to build partnerships that are meaningful, equitable, and effective. We can move beyond the tired narratives of dependency and failure and start celebrating the resilience, the innovation, and the hope that are alive and thriving across the continent. And ultimately, that's what progress looks like. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Not imposed, but chosen. Not dictated, but embraced. That's the future Africa. And the world deserves, and to all of you listening, whether you're in Ouagadougou, in Chicago, in Nairobi, or New York. Remember this: history doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the brave, and sometimes all it takes to change a nation is one conversation, one conviction, and one leader who refuses to bow. Thank you.